The war room fell silent when the casualty reports appeared on the central display, and Commander Velith Soranai stood perfectly still as name after name scrolled across the blue holographic screen before her eyes. She had commanded the Cathari Dominion's Third Fleet for over 40 cycles, and she had seen death many times before. She had watched friends fall in battle, held dying soldiers in her arms, and written countless letters to grieving families across 100 different worlds, but nothing could have prepared her for the name that now burned itself into her vision like a brand made of fire and ice. Lieutenant Myray Soranai. Status: confirmed deceased. Cause: direct plasma strike to fighter vessel during engagement at Nexus 7. Body: unrecoverable. Ivish's four-fingered hands trembled slightly as she read the words again and again, hoping somehow that she had misunderstood, that her translator was malfunctioning, that this was some terrible mistake that would soon be corrected. But the words did not change, and the truth settled into her chest like a stone dropping into deep water. Her daughter was dead. The officers around her exchanged uncomfortable glances, uncertain of what to do or say. The Cathari were not a species that showed emotion publicly, and their commander had always been the most controlled of them all, a statue of discipline and order in even the darkest moments. But now they watched as something broke behind her silver eyes, a crack forming in a wall that had stood strong for decades. "Leave me," Velith said. A voice barely above a whisper. The officers departed quickly, their footsteps echoing through the metal corridors as they fled from their commander's grief, like frightened animals running from a storm when the doors sealed shut behind them. Velith finally allowed herself to sink into her chair, her long limbs folding beneath her as the weight of loss pressed down upon her shoulders. Myray had been everything to her, her only child, her greatest pride, the living proof that even a soldier dedicated to war could create something beautiful and full of light. She remembered the day Myray had been born, how small and fragile she had seemed, how Velith had promised to protect her from every danger the universe could offer. She remembered teaching Myray to fly her first shuttle, watching her daughter's face light up with pure joy as they soared through the clouds of their homeworld together. She remembered the argument they had shared just 3 cycles ago, when Myray had announced her intention to join the fleet and fight against the Breath Collective. "You do not need to prove yourself to me," Velith had said, fear making her voice sharp and cold. "I am not trying to prove anything to you, Mother," Myray had replied with that stubborn fire in her eyes that reminded Velith so much of herself. "I am trying to protect our people, just as you taught me to do." And now Myray was gone, her fighter torn apart by enemy fire in the chaos above Nexus 7, her body lost somewhere in the endless debris field that circled a shattered moon. The recovery teams had searched for 3 full days before declaring the area too dangerous to continue. There were thousands of wrecked ships floating in that graveyard of metal and stone, and the Vreth had left automated weapons platforms that fired upon anything that moved. No body had been found, but the scans had detected Myray's fighter, or what remained of it, crushed between 2 massive asteroids that spun slowly through the darkness. There was no escape pod signal, no emergency beacon, no sign that anyone had survived the initial impact. The military council had declared her dead, and by Cathari law, that declaration was final. Velith knew she should accept this truth and move forward as her training demanded. She should honor her daughter's sacrifice and continue the fight against the Vreth. She should be strong for her soldiers and her people, but strength seemed impossible now. And honor felt like an empty word that meant nothing in the face of such terrible loss. Instead, Velith did something she had not done since she was a small child, crying for her own mother in the darkness of night. She entered the Velos, the grief silence that her people used to mourn their dead in the Velos. A Cathari would withdraw from the world, speaking to no one, eating little, spending their days in meditation and memory. Some stayed in this state for weeks, others for years, and a few never emerged at all, choosing to fade away rather than face a universe without the one they had. Loved Velith knew she could not abandon her duties for long, but she allowed herself one night of complete surrender to the pain that consumed her. She wept in the way of her people, silently, with tears that glowed faintly blue in the darkness of her quarters, and she spoke her daughter's name over and over until her throat ached and her voice grew hoarse when morning came. She forced herself to stand and face her reflection in the mirror. Her silver skin looked pale and gray, her eyes dull and empty, but she was still alive, still breathing, still bound by duty and honor. She would commission a memory crystal for Myrae, as tradition demanded. She would gather her daughter's belongings and preserve them in the family shrine. She would speak the sacred words that would release Myrae's spirit to join their ancestors in the eternal light. But even as she began these preparations, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded very much like her daughter. "They never found my body." "Mother." Velith tried to silence this voice, tried to accept the reality that the military council had declared, tried to believe that hope was nothing more than a cruel trick that grief played upon the minds of those left behind. But the voice would not be silent, and the question it asked would not go away. What if she was wrong to give up so easily? What if there was still a chance, however small, that Myrae had survived? No, she told herself firmly. The scans had shown no life signs. The recovery teams had found no evidence of survival. The military council had followed all proper protocols. Myrae was dead, and nothing could change that truth. Far away, in the cold darkness of the debris field above the shattered moon, a small human ship called the Second Chance drifted slowly through the wreckage, its captain scanning the endless field of destruction with eyes that refused to accept what others called impossible. His name was Elias Vance, and he had made a career out of finding hope where everyone else saw only death. Elias Vance had been called many things throughout his 53 years of life: stubborn fool, reckless idiot, crazy old man who should know better than to risk his neck for strangers who were probably already dead anyway. Accepted all of these titles with a crooked smile and a shrug of his broad shoulders, because he knew something that most people in the galaxy seemed to have forgotten. Dead was not dead until he said it was dead as ship. The Second Chance was an ugly thing, a patchwork vessel held together by welded plates, salvaged parts, and what his crew jokingly called pure human stubbornness. But she had carried him through 100 rescue missions across a dozen star systems, and she had never let him down when it mattered most. Today she drifted through the debris field of Nexus 7, her sensors sweeping the darkness for any sign of survivors that the official rescue teams might have missed. "Captain, the Cathari declared this whole sector unrecoverable 3 days ago," said his first mate, a young woman named Rosa Chen, who had joined his crew after he pulled her from a crashed transport ship 2 years earlier. "I know what the Cathari declared," Ilias replied without looking away from his scanner display. "And I also know that they give up too easily." Rosa sighed and crossed her arms, a gesture that Ilias had come to recognize as her way of saying, "Here we go again." Without actually speaking the words aloud, "The debris is too dense. The automated weapons are still active, and there is literally no reason to believe anyone survived that battle," she said, listing the facts as if they would somehow change his mind. Ilias finally turned to face her, his weathered face splitting into that familiar grin that had driven countless colleagues and friends to frustration over the years. "Rosa, how many times have people told me there was no reason to believe someone survived?" She hesitated, knowing exactly where this conversation was heading. 17, she admitted quietly. "And how many times were they right?" Rosa looked away, unable to argue with the simple truth that stood at the heart of everything Elias Vance believed: 0 times. They had been wrong every single time. Elias had spent 20 years as a combat medic in the Human Defense Corps before retiring to become a salvage operator. And in those 20 years, he had learned one lesson above all others. The universe was full of people who gave up too soon, who accepted death as final before they had exhausted every possible option, who walked away from crashed ships and burning buildings because the odds were too low to justify the risk. He refused to be one of those people. "Captain, I am picking up something strange," called out his engineer, a heavy-set man named Marcus, who had been watching the secondary scanner station. Elias moved quickly across the bridge, his boots clanking against the metal floor as he leaned over Marcus's shoulder to examine the reading. "What am I looking at?" "It is not a life sign exactly," Marcus said, his thick fingers dancing across the controls as he tried to refine the signal. "But there is some kind of energy fluctuation coming from that cluster of asteroids about 2 kilometers to port." Elias studied the display, his experienced eyes picking out the faint anomaly that most scanners would have dismissed as background radiation or equipment error. But Elias had seen this pattern before, not often, and never with such a weak signal. But he knew what it meant. "That is a Cathari escape pod," he said softly, almost to himself. "Impossible," Rosa said, moving to join them at the scanner station. "The Cathari recovery teams would have detected any active escape pods. Their sensors are far more advanced than ours. Their sensors are designed to detect active pods." Elias corrected her. "But what if this pod is not active in the normal sense? What if the occupant went into deep stasis?" Rose's eyes widened as she understood what he was suggesting. She had studied xenobiology during her academy training, and she knew that the Cathari possessed an emergency survival mechanism that no other species in the known galaxy could replicate when facing certain death. A Cathari could force their body into a state called valoric suspension, a form of biological stasis, so deep that it was virtually indistinguishable from death itself. Their hearts would slow to 1 beat per hour. Their brain activity would drop to nearly zero, and their cells would enter a kind of frozen twilight that could theoretically preserve them for years. But there was a terrible catch that made this ability more curse than blessing. No Cathari had ever been successfully revived from deep valoric suspension. The process that preserved their bodies also seemed to crystallize their neural pathways, locking their minds in an unchangeable pattern that could not be awakened by any known medical procedure to Cathari physicians. Someone in deep suspension was already dead. Their body merely had not accepted this fact yet, even if someone is in that pod. "They are beyond saving," Rosa said gently, placing a hand on Elias's arm. "The Cathari themselves have given up on reviving people from that state." Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring at the faint signal on the screen, as if it held some secret that only he could see. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and certain in a way that made Rosa's heart sink, because she knew that voice meant he had already made up his mind. "The Cathari have given up," he said, "but I have not. Get me a suit ready. I am going out there." What followed was 6 hours of the most dangerous work Elias had ever attempted in his long career. The escape pod was wedged between 2 asteroids that rotated slowly around each other, creating a constantly shifting maze of rock and metal that threatened to crush anything caught between them. The automated weapons platforms fired at him twice, forcing him to take cover behind chunks of debris while his suit's shields flickered and sparked. His oxygen supply dropped to critical levels 3 separate times, requiring Rosa to pilot the second chance, dangerously close to resupply him before retreating to a safe distance. But Elias refused to turn back, refused to accept that this mission was impossible, refused to leave whoever was inside that pod alone in the darkness. When he finally cut through the pod's damaged hull and pulled himself inside, he found exactly what he had expected and feared in equal measure: a young Cathari, Woman lay motionless in the emergency stasis chamber. Her silver skin pale and cold, her eyes closed. Her body showing no signs of life that any standard medical scanner would recognize, but Elias was not using a standard medical scanner. He was using his hands, his instincts, and 50 years of refusing to accept the easy answer. He pressed his palm against her chest and felt it, so faint that he almost convinced himself he had imagined it, a single beat of her heart. Slow and weak but undeniably present. "Rosa," he said into his communicator, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Prep the medical bay and get me everything we have on Cathari physiology. We have a survivor, and I am bringing her home in the cold darkness of the pod." Lieutenant Mireille Serenai remained frozen between life and death, unaware that a stubborn old human had just decided that her story was not over yet. The medical bay of the Second Chance was never designed to treat a Cathari patient. And in the first few hours after Elias brought the young woman aboard, it seemed like the universe itself was determined to prove that his rescue mission had been pointless. Every Cathari medical text said the same thing. Deep valoric suspension was a death sentence that simply took longer to execute. The body might survive for years in that frozen state, but the mind was gone forever. Trapped in a prison of crystallized neurons that could never be unlocked, Elias read these texts carefully, studied the diagrams and research papers, listened to the recorded testimonies of Cathari, physicians who had spent their entire careers trying and failing to revive patients from this condition, and then he set all of it aside and decided to do things his own way. "You cannot be serious," Marcus said when Elias explained his plan to the crew. "Everything we know about Cathari biology says this is impossible. Their own doctors have been trying to solve this problem for centuries. Their own doctors have been trying to solve it using Cathari methods," Elias replied calmly. "Maybe it is time to try some human methods instead." Rosa shook her head slowly, worry evident in her dark eyes. She had followed Elias into dangerous situations before, but this was different. This was not a rescue mission or a salvage operation. This was an attempt to do something that the entire galaxy believed could not be done. What human methods could possibly work on an alien nervous system? She asked. Elias smiled that crooked smile of his and pulled up a series of old medical files on the display screen, records from his days as a combat medic. Cases that had been classified and buried because they did not fit neatly into official military protocols during the war. "I saw soldiers come back from conditions that should have killed them," he said, scrolling through the files. "Brain injuries that should have been permanent, comas that should have been irreversible, neural damage that every textbook said was untreatable. And do you know what the common factor was in almost every successful recovery?" The crew waited in silence, uncertain where he was going with this. "Someone refused to give up on them," Elias said simply. "Someone sat by their bed, talked to them, reminded them that they were still connected to the world of the living. The doctors called it impossible, said I was wasting my time, told me to accept the inevitable and move on. But I kept talking, kept trying, kept believing that somewhere deep inside those broken minds, something was still listening." He turned to face the pod where Mireille lay motionless, her silver skin glowing faintly in the soft light of the medical bay. "I do not know if it will work on a Cathari," he admitted, "but I know that doing nothing guarantees failure, and I have never been very good at doing nothing." Over the next 31 days, Elias attempted something that no human had ever tried before, the revival of a Cathari from deep valoric suspension, using nothing but human intuition, improvised medical equipment, and sheer stubborn determination. He started by warming her body slowly, raising her temperature by a fraction of a degree each day, using modified thermal blankets designed for human patients. The Cathari texts warned that rapid warming could cause cellular damage, so he moved with painful patience. Fighting his own desire to rush the process, he rigged human defibrillation equipment to interface with her alien cardiovascular system, sending tiny electrical pulses into her chest at carefully timed intervals that gradually encouraged her heart to beat faster and stronger. He studied her neural patterns using every scanner on the ship, looking for any sign that her brain was responding to external stimuli. Any flicker of activity that might indicate her mind was still present beneath the crystallized surface, and every single day, without exception, he sat beside her bed and talked to her. He told her about his life, about growing up on a farm on Earth, about joining the military because he wanted to help people, about the day he realized that the best way to help was to never give up on anyone, no matter how hopeless their situation seemed. He told her about his crew, about Rose's terrible cooking, and Marcus's collection of ancient music recordings, and the way they all complained about his stubbornness while secretly being grateful for. I told her about the war she had been fighting, reading her reports from the battle at Nexus 7, describing the movements of her fleet, honoring the sacrifice she had made when she flew her damaged fighter toward the enemy rather than retreating to safety. He told her about the stars outside the viewport, describing the colors and patterns that she could not see with her eyes closed, painting pictures with his words that he hoped might somehow reach whatever part of her was still listening. His crew thought he had lost his mind. Marcus stopped arguing after the first week, simply shaking his head and focusing on keeping the ship running. Rosa brought Elias food and made sure he slept at least a few hours each night. But she had given up trying to convince him that his efforts were pointless, and yet, as the days passed, something began to change on day 12. Marie's heart rate increased slightly, still far below normal, but noticeably faster than before on day 19. A neural scan showed the first signs of activity in her visual cortex, as if her brain was trying to process the light that filtered through her closed eyelids on day 25. Her fingers twitched, just once, just barely. But Elias saw it and felt his heart leap with hope that he had been afraid to let himself feel. He doubled his efforts, talking to her for hours at a time, his voice growing hoarse but never stopping, refusing to let silence fill the medical bay, because silence meant giving up on day 30. Marie's lips moved, no sound came out, but Elias saw them part and close, as if she was trying to form words in her sleep. And he leaned close and whispered encouragement that he was not sure she could hear. "Come on, kid," he said softly. "You have been sleeping long enough. There is a whole universe out there waiting for you, and I promise it is worth waking up for on day 31. As the artificial morning light filled the medical bay, and Elias sat in his usual chair with a cup of cold coffee in his hands, Marie's eyes opened. They were silver like her skin, bright and confused and very much alive, and they stared at the ceiling for a long moment before slowly turning to focus on the weathered human face that watched her with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Welcome back," Elias said, his voice breaking on the words. "My name is Elias, and I have been waiting a long time to meet you." Marie opened her mouth, struggled to make her voice work after so many weeks of silence, and finally managed to whisper a single word that would stay with Elias for the rest of his life. "How?" He smiled that crooked smile and reached out to gently squeeze her cold hand. "I will tell you all about it," he promised. "But first, let me contact your family. There is a mother out there who needs to know that her daughter is alive." Commander Valith and I stood before the memorial shrine she had built for her daughter, surrounded by floating candles that cast dancing shadows across the walls of her private quarters. The memory crystal in her hands pulsed with soft blue light, filled with every image and recording of Marie that Valith had been able to gather. Her first steps as a child, Her graduation from the academy, the last message she had sent before the battle at Nexus 7. In a few moments, Valeth would speak the sacred words that would seal this crystal forever, releasing her daughter's spirit to join their ancestors in the eternal light and closing the book on a life that had ended far too soon. Her hands trembled as she raised the crystal toward the shrine, her voice thick with grief as she began to recite the ancient phrases that every Kithari learned from childhood. In the name of those who came before us, I release you from the bonds of this world. And the communication terminal behind her suddenly burst to life with an urgent signal, its harsh tone shattering the solemn silence of the ceremony. Valith's first instinct was to ignore it. She had given strict orders that she was not to be disturbed during the final rites. Whatever military matter demanded her attention could wait until she had finished honoring her daughter's memory, but something made her hesitate, perhaps the strange frequency of the signal, or the unfamiliar identification code that flashed across the screen, or simply the desperate hope that had never quite died in her heart. Despite all her efforts to bury it, she set the memory crystal down carefully and crossed the room to answer the Kala. Human face appeared on the screen, weathered and tired, with deep lines around eyes that held a kindness Valith had rarely seen in the soldiers and diplomats she usually dealt with. Commander Valith Sorenai? The human asked. Yes, she replied, her voice cold and impatient. Who are you, and why have you interrupted a sacred ceremony to contact me? The human smiled, not with mockery or arrogance, but with a warmth that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances. My name is Elias Vance, and I'm sorry to disturb you, but I have someone here who wants to say hello. Before Valith could demand an explanation, the screen shifted to show a medical bed in a small, cluttered room that looked nothing like any hospital she had ever seen, and lying in that bed, propped up against pillows with a thin blanket pulled across her lap, was her daughter. Murray looked weak and pale, her silver skin lacking its usual luster, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but she was unmistakably alive, breathing, blinking, moving her lips in a smile that Valith had never expected to see again. Hello, Mother, Murray said, her voice barely above a whisper, but strong enough to carry across the vast distance between them. The memory crystal slipped from Valith's numb fingers and shattered against the floor, its blue light scattering into 1,000 fragments that faded into darkness as the magic it contained was released without purpose. But Valith did not notice. She did not notice the candles flickering out or the shrine falling silent or the concerned voices of her officers calling through the door to ask if she was all right. All she could see was her daughter's face on the screen, alive and real and impossible. And for the first time in 40 cycles of military service, Commander Valith Sorenai collapsed to her knees and wept in great heaving sobs that shook her entire body like storms shaking ancient trees. The journey to the second chance took 3 days, even in the fastest ship the Cathari fleet could provide. And every minute of that journey felt like an eternity to Valith. She paced the corridors of her vessel like a caged animal, unable to eat or sleep or focus on anything except the knowledge that her daughter was waiting for her at the end of this impossible voyage. When her ship finally docked with the small human salvage vessel, Valith was the first one through the airlock, pushing past her guards and attendants with an urgency that surprised everyone who had known her as the calm and controlled commander of the Third Fleet. The interior of the second chance was cramped and cluttered, filled with salvaged equipment and personal belongings that seemed to occupy every available surface. It was nothing like the clean and orderly Cathari vessels Valith was accustomed to, but she barely noticed the chaos as she followed the human woman named Rosa through the narrow corridors toward the medical bay. And then she was there, standing in the doorway, looking at her daughter, who sat upright in bed with a bowl of something that smelled terrible but was apparently human food clutched in her hands. Mirai looked up and saw her mother, and her face transformed with an expression of pure joy that cut through all the pain and fear and grief like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Mother," she said, setting aside the bowl and opening her arms. Valith crossed the room in 3 quick strides and gathered her daughter into an embrace so tight that Mireille laughed and complained that she could not breathe. But neither of them let go, clinging to each other as if afraid that this moment might prove to be just another cruel dream that would fade with waking. "I thought I had lost you," Valith whispered into her daughter's hair, her voice cracking with emotion she had never allowed herself to show before. "I thought you were gone forever, and I did not know how I would continue living in a universe without you." "I almost was gone," Mireille admitted, pulling back slightly to look into her mother's silver eyes. "But someone refused to let me stay dead." She turned to look at the corner of the room, where a disheveled human man stood watching the reunion with a gentle smile on his weathered face. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and looked like he had not slept properly in weeks. But his eyes were bright with satisfaction and something that might have been pride. "Mother, this is Elias Vance," Mireille said. "He found me in the debris field, brought me to his ship, and spent 31 days figuring out how to wake me up from Valeric suspension. He did something that every Cathari doctor in the galaxy said was impossible." Valith released her daughter and turned to face this human who had somehow given her back everything she thought she had lost. She did not know what to say. The Cathari language had no words adequate to express gratitude of this magnitude. Her people measured debts carefully and repaid them precisely. But how could anyone measure or repay the gift of a child's life? Elias seemed to understand her struggle, because he simply offered an awkward bow and said the most human thing imaginable. "No need to thank me, Commander. I was just doing my job." Mireille laughed at her mother's bewildered expression. "He has been saying that for days," she explained, "and I still cannot make him understand what he has done for us." Valith looked from her daughter to the human and back again, feeling something shift in her understanding of the galaxy and all the strange species that inhabited it. "How?" she finally asked, echoing the same question her daughter had asked upon waking. "How did you accomplish what our greatest physicians could not?" Elias shrugged his shoulders in that casual human way that seemed almost disrespectful given the gravity of the situation. "I just refused to give up," he said simply. "And I talked to her every day until she decided to wake up and tell me to shut up." Mireille reached out and took her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "He would not let me stay dead, Mother," she said softly. "He said that humans do not know how to quit," and in that moment, standing in the cluttered medical bay of a battered human ship, Commander Valith Suranai began to understand that perhaps the galaxy was stranger and more wonderful than she had ever imagined. In the weeks that followed, Commander Valith Suranai tried everything she could think of to repay Elias Vance for what he had done. She offered him wealth, enough credits to buy a fleet of new ships and live in luxury for the rest of his life. He declined politely, saying that he already had everything he needed. She offered him titles and honors, formal recognition from the Qatari, dominion that would make him a hero to billions of people across 100 worlds. He declined again, looking uncomfortable at the very idea of ceremonies and speeches. She offered him a commission in the Qatari fleet, a position of respect and authority that would come with a beautiful ship and a crew of the finest soldiers in the galaxy. He laughed out loud at this one and said he would make a terrible Qatari officer. "I do not understand you," Valith finally admitted as they sat together in the observation lounge of her ship, watching the stars drift past the viewport while Mireille rested in her quarters below. In Qatari culture, debts must be balanced. When someone gives you something of value, you must give something of equal value in return. This is the foundation of our entire society. Elias sipped his coffee. He always seemed to have a cup in his hand, no matter the hour, and considered her words carefully before responding. Think that might be the difference between our people, he said slowly. Humans do not really keep score like that. We help each other because it is the right thing to do, not because we expect something in return. Vailith shook her head, struggling to comprehend a worldview so fundamentally different from everything she had been taught. But you risked your life, she pressed. You spent 6 hours in a damaged suit cutting through debris while weapons platforms fired at you. You used your own resources to treat my daughter for 31 days. You defied everything the galaxy believed about Cathari biology. How can you say that you expect nothing for all of this? Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the endless darkness between the stars. When I was a young medic, he finally said, I watched a lot of people die because their comrades had given up on them too soon. They were not dead yet, but everyone acted like they were. Because the odds were bad, and the situation was dangerous, and it was easier to accept loss than to fight against it. He set down his coffee cup and turned to face her, his weathered face serious in a way she had not seen before. I decided back then that I would never be one of those people. I would never walk away from someone who might still be saved. No matter what the odds said, no matter what the experts believed, no matter how much easier it would be to give up and move on. His eyes met hers with a directness that felt almost uncomfortable. Your daughter was still in there, Commander. I could feel it somehow, even when all the machines said otherwise. And if there was even the smallest chance that I could bring her back, then I had to try. Not for a reward, not for recognition, not because I expected anything from you or her. Just because it was the right thing to do, and because I could not live with myself if I walked away. Vailith sat in silence, feeling something shift deep within her understanding of the universe. For centuries, her people had viewed humans as chaotic and unpredictable, driven by emotions rather than logic, prone to reckless behavior that often seemed foolish or dangerous. The Cathari had respected human military power and technological ingenuity, but they had never truly understood what drove these strange beings to act the way they did now. For the first time, Vailith began to see humans through different eyes. What she had mistaken for chaos was actually something far more powerful, a refusal to accept limitations, a stubborn hope that persisted even when logic demanded surrender, a capacity for compassion that extended beyond the boundaries of family or species or personal. Benefitilius had not saved her daughter because he expected a reward, or because the odds were in his favor, or because some code of honor demanded had saved her daughter, because somewhere in his human heart, he believed that every life was worth fighting for, regardless of the cost or the consequences. This was something the Cathari did not have a word for, because they had never imagined that such a thing could exist. You have changed something in me, Vailith said quietly, and I do not know if I can ever go back to seeing the universe the way I did before. Elias smiled that crooked smile of his. Change is not always a bad thing. Commander, 3 days later, Myrae was strong enough to walk without assistance, and she found Elias in the docking bay, preparing the second chance for departure. His crew was loading supplies and running system checks, eager to return to their work, salvaging wreckage and searching for survivors in the forgotten corners of the galaxy. You are leaving, Myrae said. And it was not a question. Elias turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been sadness at the thought of saying goodbye. I have been away from my work too long, he said. There are other people out there who need finding, other families who are waiting for news of loved ones they think they have lost. I cannot stay in one place when there is so much of the galaxy left to search. Myrae nodded, understanding completely. She was a soldier herself, after all, and she knew what it meant to have a duty that called you away from those you cared about. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small crystal that glowed with soft blue light, not the light of a memory crystal meant to honor the dead, but something older and more sacred. This is a Valorican token, she explained. Holding it out to him, it marks you as one who holds a piece of our soul. In our culture, it means that you are forever connected to our family, bound by ties that are stronger than blood or politics or distance. Elias hesitated, clearly uncertain whether he should accept something so obviously precious. I do not need. It is not about what you need, Myray interrupted gently. It is about what you deserve. And more than that, it is a promise. She pressed the crystal into his calloused hand and closed his fingers around it. When you die, human, whether it is tomorrow or 50 years from now, we will search for you. No matter how long it takes, no matter what anyone else says, no matter how impossible it seems, we will find you and bring you home, just as you found me and brought me back to my mother. Elias looked at the crystal in his hand, then back at the young Cathari woman who had become something like a daughter to him over the past weeks. Does this mean I have to attend Cathari holidays now? He asked, and there was a suspicious brightness in his eyes that suggested he was trying very hard not to. Crimeray almost smiled, a gesture she had learned from, watching him, and shook her head. It means that you will never be forgotten, she said, and that somewhere in the galaxy, there will always be people who are grateful that you exist. Elias tucked the crystal carefully into his jacket pocket, right next to his heart, and then did something that surprised both of them. He pulled Mireille into a hug, brief and awkward. The way humans showed affection, and whispered something in her ear that she would remember for the rest of her very long life. Take care of your mother, kid. She loves you more than you know. And then he was gone, climbing the ramp into his ugly patchwork ship, disappearing into the darkness of space to continue his endless search for those who had been given up on, those who had been left behind, those who were waiting somewhere in the wreckage for someone stubborn enough to believe they could still be Savid Murray. Watched the second chance until it was nothing but a speck of light among the stars. And she made a silent vow that she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand and embody the lesson that a stubborn old human had taught her. Hope was not foolishness. It was the most powerful force in the galaxy, and sometimes all it took was one person who refused to quit.